3 minutes after she dragged her sick son into the cellar, she realized she'd made a mistake. The door was moving, not rattling, swinging hard enough to tear off its hinges. She had built that door herself, and 3 minutes earlier, she had been certain it would hold. Outside, a tornado was crossing the fields. Inside, her son was burning with fever. And between them was a door she had copied from something buried in the ground long before she was born. This is the story of the shelter she found underground, and the mistake she made trying to rebuild it. Subscribe so you don't lose this channel, and keep seeing stories about the resourcefulness that kept people alive, and the discoveries that turned out to be their only way through. Sarah wasn't the kind of woman who frightened easily. She knew storms. She knew what the sky looked like before rain, and what it looked like before something worse. She knew when to stop working and wait. This one was different. It started with the boy. He coughed at breakfast. She put her hand to his forehead. A little warm. Nothing that would have stopped the day's work. Then, before noon, he stopped asking for food and stopped fighting the blanket she kept pulling back over him. She noticed the sky when she came back from the barn. The clouds were building too quickly, stacking on themselves the way trouble does when it means business. Not a summer shower, something bigger. Her husband Thomas came out behind her. He didn't ask what she was looking at. He already knew. "We need to go." Sarah didn't turn around. "The boy can't travel." He looked at her. "Then we'll have to make him." The town was several miles away. The road was open, for now. In the particular way that word meant nothing yet. But the boy could barely stand, and the clouds were moving faster than they should have. She looked toward the road, then at her son, then at the cellar behind the house. It had been built to keep food cold, not to keep people alive. A hole for potatoes, not for hope. But it was the only shelter they had. She picked up a shovel. Sarah started with the cellar floor. It was barely deep enough to stand in, and the ceiling was low enough that her husband had to duck. It had been perfectly good for potatoes. It was not a shelter. She needed more room, more earth above them, and a way to secure the entrance so the door wouldn't be ripped out by the wind. So she dug. The first foot came easily. The second did not. Her shovel struck something hard. Not stone. Wood. She stopped. Have you ever had to trust something you didn't understand, just because there wasn't time to figure it out? She cleared another handful of dirt. Then another. A plank appeared. Then the edge of a frame. There had been something here before, and whoever had built it had left the entrance at a strange angle. She didn't know why, only that there was no time to find out. She cleared enough dirt to see the hole opening. It was not much to look at. Old boards, a crooked frame, earth packed hard around the edges, but it had survived. She ran her hand along the frame. The wood was dark with age. Some of it had rotted away, and still the shape remained. One side stood higher than the other. The entrance seemed to lean into the earth. Why? She looked back toward the house. Thomas was already getting the horse ready. The boy was getting worse, and the clouds had swallowed half the sky. She looked at the old entrance again, not fully understanding the angle or the force the old builders had been guarding against, only that it had outlived the people who built it. So she copied what she could see. At the time, it seemed like the obvious thing to do. Thomas came back from the barn with the horse saddled. He looked at the sky once. "I'm going for the doctor." She looked at the boy, then at the road. "You won't make it back." He didn't answer, because they both knew she was right. He took the road anyway, into a sky that had already made up its mind. The storm was moving toward them faster than either of them had expected. Then he was gone. No one to check the frame. No one to tell her whether the angle was right. She had only what she could see, what she remembered, and whatever she could figure out before the storm arrived. She picked up the next board, and then the one after that, until the counting stopped meaning anything. She worked faster. She measured once, cut once, checked the frame with her shoulder. It wasn't pretty. It didn't have to be. It had to hold. The first drops struck the roof like something testing its patience. Then came the wind. Dust lifted from the yard and moved across the fields. She drove the last peg into the frame. It wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But there was no more time to want it to be. She grabbed the boy first. He could barely walk and weighed in her arms like something that had already given up carrying itself. Her daughter followed with the blanket. The first hard gust hit the house. Something struck the roof. Not a branch, something with weight behind it. Down the steps, inside. She pulled the door shut behind them. And for the first time that afternoon, there was silence. The children could hear their own breathing. She could hear the boy coughing. Above them, the house groaned, a sound it had never made before, not in 5 winters. She put one hand against the door. It felt solid. For a few seconds, she believed it might be enough. Then the sound changed. It wasn't the sound of rain anymore. It was a low, continuous roar, the kind you feel in the ground before you hear it in the air. The earth trembled beneath them. Dust fell from the ceiling. Her daughter grabbed her arm. Then the door moved, just a little at first. She pushed against it. The wind pushed back harder. She could feel the force traveling through the wood, like something enormous testing the other end of a rope. Her hand slipped, and for half a second, the door was winning. She looked at the frame, then remembered the old entrance, the strange angle. She had copied it, but not exactly. She had copied the shape, but not. She was only now understanding what made it work. The old entrance hadn't just been a door cut into the ground. It had been part of the shelter's structure. The angle changed how the force reached the frame. Her version was driving the force almost straight into the weakest point, the hinges. She could feel them beginning to give. Not a snap, a slow surrender, metal working itself loose. The old builders hadn't made the entrance strange. They had made it strong. She looked around the cramped shelter. A bench, a shelf of jars, a lantern swinging uselessly on its hook. There was no time to rebuild anything, so she did the only thing she could: move the brace. Not to hold the door shut by itself, but to give the force somewhere else to go, into the frame, into the walls, into the earth around them, like a prayer said to something that couldn't answer but might still be listening. The door slammed once. She held the brace. The wood groaned, the way a tree groans right before it decides at the last second not to fall. Then the force shifted. The door stopped moving. She held on for several seconds, afraid to let go. When she finally did, the door stayed where it was. The roar began to fade. The children stopped crying, their breathing gone slow and even, the way it does right before sleep. Somewhere above them, something dripped. A thin line of daylight appeared around the frame. She let herself breathe. Maybe it was over. Then she heard it again, far away at first, another low roar. Her daughter looked at her, too tired to be as frightened as the sound deserved. She didn't answer, because now she knew what the sound meant. The second tornado came closer. This time the wind hit the house from a different direction, a pressure change she felt in her ears before she understood it. The first storm had already done its damage. The roof above them was weaker. The ground was littered with debris. Somewhere out there was a piece of her own roof. And whatever had been holding the house together had already begun to fail. The roar became deafening, and the walls shook with it, the way they shake in the last second before they stop being walls. Something heavy landed above them, hard enough that dust sifted down between the boards. The door flexed. Her daughter screamed as the brace shifted. For 1 second, she thought it was going to fail, and let herself imagine, just for that second, what came after. But this time she knew what to watch. Not the door, the frame. She could see where the load was traveling. The wood was bending, but the frame was holding. Bending, she now understood, was not the same as failing. The walls were taking the force, and the earth around them was doing what the old builders had counted on it to do. Then the house above them disappeared. Not all at once. First the roof, then the walls. The sound was so loud that the children could no longer hear each other. She pulled them against her and waited. Then, suddenly, nothing. No wind, no rain, no house above them. Just breathing. Then she waited another minute before touching the door. She pushed. Nothing. The entrance was blocked from the outside. The house had come down on top of them. They had survived the storm. Now they had to survive being buried. And she found it easier to count breaths than minutes. Thomas came back after dark. The road was almost gone. Trees lay across it. Fences were down. When he reached the farm, he stopped. There was no house, no horse, no smoke, no movement. Nothing but a promise he'd made to a woman who told him not to bother. He called their names. Nothing answered. He searched the ruins until his hands were bleeding. He found pieces of the roof, a chair, a child's shoe which he set down carefully, the way you set down something you're not ready to admit you're keeping. But no one. Then he noticed something strange. The ground behind the house was lower than it should have been. Ground he'd walked 100 times and would have sworn he knew. He remembered the cellar. He started digging. A thin hope, but more than he'd had a minute before. Not where the door had been, beside it. The old earth had been disturbed. And underneath it, he found the same timber Sarah had found that afternoon. The old entrance. The old frame had created a weak point in the surrounding earth. He followed it, not from logic he could have explained, but the way you know a footstep on the stairs before you see who it is. A few feet later, he heard something. 3 knocks. He stopped. Then came another 3. And dropped to his knees. They were alive. And for a moment, that one fact was the only thing in the world. He dug until he reached the door. She pushed from the other side, and neither of them hurried, as if hurrying might make the moment less true. When it finally opened, he just stood there. She looked at him. He looked at the shelter. Neither of them said anything. He didn't need to. The children pressed in around his legs, and for a long moment, nobody moved. Thomas touched the doorframe, not to test it this time, just to feel, under his hand, the thing that had kept them alive. The strange angle hadn't protected them by magic. It had done something much simpler. It changed the path of the force. A flat entrance puts more of the wind's force directly onto the door and its hardware, which is why the hinges gave first. A properly braced, earth-covered structure gives that force somewhere else to go. Into the frame, into the walls, into the ground. The earth doesn't care that the wind is strong. It simply gives the force a much larger structure to push against, a kind of humility built into the ground itself. 3 minutes after she had closed that door, she thought she had made a mistake. She had. But the mistake taught her what the old builders had already known, and the following spring she would rebuild the entrance properly, from the same instinct, not from a book. The door was never supposed to fight the storm alone. The earth was part of the door, and once she understood that, the strange angle finally made sense, the way a language makes sense once you hear someone finally speak it correctly. We don't know whether anyone else on that farm ever built another shelter exactly like hers. We do know that people on the frontier learned from structures that survived. Not because they understood every force involved. Often, they simply knew what worked and passed it down the only way they could, not as an explanation, but as a shape. Sometimes, survival looks like superstition, right up until you understand the physics.